This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Everyone, so now we're continuing on the second leg of our trip. We're here in the south in Provence. When we were more north, we spoke about the family of Rashi and the 6 generations. Rashi, his son-in-laws, Rabbeinu Tam Rashbam, Ri Hazaken, and Rabbeinu Elchana, Rabbeinu Shmuel. Now this is the Ravid territory. This is Ravid land. And we're going to speak, we're headed to the kever of the Ravid. I do not believe that most people who come to France or Provence have ever gone to the gravesite of the Ravid. But before you go to the Ravid's kever, before you know who the Ravid is, you need to know who the Ravid is not. So, as we mentioned a number of times, and now we'll explain, there were 3 Ravids. The most well-known Ravid, the Ravid who wrote the Hasagas on the Rambam, wrote Hasagas on the Rif, wrote a Parish on the Taras Kayanim, was the 3rd and the final Ravid. The first Ravid is known as Rabbi Avram ibn Daud, or Ibn David, who was a Spanish astronomer, historian, philosopher, who wrote a very important work called Sefer HaKabbalah, nothing to do with mysticism, but rather of the historical traditions of the Jewish people, continuing from Rav Shiur Gaon. This Reb Avram ben David, the first Ravid, was killed al Kiddush Hashem. He wrote a renowned mathematical compilation, and he defended in the Sefer HaKabbalah traditional Judaism from Karaite attack. Now, there's one very famous and controversial account that appears in the Sefer HaKabbalah, and that is about the 4 hostages who were setting sail from Bari, Italy, and they were kidnapped by pirates and ransomed, and that really was the seminal moment that transferred the power of Torah from Bavel to North Africa, to Spain, to Italy, and to other communities. That is found in the Sefer HaKabbalah of Ravid number 1, Rabbi Avram ben David. He also wrote a work called Al Akida Al Rafia. So he wrote a number of works, some and even in Latin. As we mentioned, he was a historian. He was born in 1110. He was of Spanish origin, and he passed away either in 1160 or 1180. That's Ravid number 1. Now we're up to Ravid number 2. Ravid number 2 was also born in 1110. He passed away in Narbonne in Provence in 1179, and he was one of the early founders of provincial Jewry. He was a Talmud of Rav Moshe Hadarshan, and one of the powerful provincial leaders, Rav Todros ben Moshe, appointed Ravid II to be the Av Bezdin. He's known as Rabbi Avram Av Bezdin. So he's called Ravid not because he's Ben David, but because he's Av Bezdin. Now, he was the Rebbe of Rabbi Avram ben David, Ravid III, and his future son-in-law. He is also the Rebbe of Rab Zerachia Halevi. Now, Rabbi Avram ben David, Ravid III, and Rab Zerachia Halevi had many very fierce halachic battles. The Rab Zerachia Halevi wrote the Bal Hamar, and the Bal Hamar challenges many of the conclusions of the Rif, and the Ravid attacked vehemently the Bal Hamar. He said that anything good the Bal Hamar wrote, the Bal Hamar took from him, from the Ravid III. And when Reb Zerachia Halevi passed away, then the challenges of Ravid III mellowed a little bit. But in the Sefer Divrei Rivos, it's recorded all of the disputes between Ravid III and the Bal Hamar. Now, Ravid II, the father-in-law of Ravid the Ravid III, is considered one of the earliest Mikubalim. So perhaps the first known Makubal, Kabbalist, was Ravid II, Rabbi Avram ibn David, Rabbi Avram Av Bezdin, and it's interesting because he is the first one that's reputed to have had Gilui Eliyahu. Now, Ravid III definitely had Gilui Eliyahu. Ravid III is Rabbi Avram ben David of Pokier, and he was born in Narbonne in 1120, and he passed away in Pokier in 1197. Ravid III, in his Hasagas on the Rambam, in a number of places. He writes, Kach Niglali Misoid Hashem Lireav. He writes this in Hilchos Lulav. He writes this in other places, that he had divine revelations in the area of halacha, that God came to him, that he had Gili Eliyahu in the halachic process. So these are the three Ravids. We're going to Ravid the third. Now, when we get to Ravid the third, we're going to learn the Ravid the third had a very saintly son who was blind, Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nahar. Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nahar wrote a kuntras called Soid Hadlokas Ner Chanukah. Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nahar, Rabbeinu Bechaye writes in Parshas Vayeshev, was the father of Kabbalah, was the father of all Mekubalim. So, although his grandfather, Ram Av Bezdin, was one of the earliest Mekubalim, the grandson, Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nahar, is considered the father of the Mekubalim. He taught two Mekubalim, Rav Ezra and Rav Azriel, who the Ramban learned Kabbalah from, and that began the tradition of Kabbalah in Klal Yisrael. So we're headed to Ravid the third, Rabbi Avram ben David of Pokiers, who lived, again, from 1120 to 1197. Zechusam Yagin Aleinu.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.